everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So today I'm trying a new setup. I have this chair now, so it's very comfortable, and I wanted to chat about academia, particularly research. And what inspired me was this interview between two historians that I read just recently. I finished it today, and I have so many thoughts. First, about this historian's story, and I want to really talk about that, but also about how my journey has differed from hers, at least obviously as an early career scholar. So I thought this would be a great opportunity for me to talk about my own journey while also talking about this historian's journey. Now, the historian is Natalie Zemon Davis, whom I have talked about so often on this channel. Natalie Zemon Davis, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, and Peter Brown are my three scholarly heroes. They are historians whom I'd love to meet before they die. And I say that because I think all three of them are elderly now. Natalie Zemon Davis, when she gave the interview, was 81. Now she is 91, 92. So these scholars are advanced in years, and I really love to meet them before they go. They've had a huge effect on the direction that historiography has taken in the last century. Natalie Zemon Davis wrote two books, The Return of Martin Guerre, which, if you are interested in knowing that trial, I will link my video on it below, as well as Fiction in the Archives. My favorite of her works is Fiction in the Archives, which looks at letters of remission and the narrative of these letters of remission, what they might reveal to us about peasants in the 16th century. A lot of her work has been done on marginalized individuals, women, Jews, Muslims, oftentimes peasants, and she really helped spearhead the historiographies that have developed since that look at lesser known voices in the historical documents. I definitely encourage you to watch my video on The Return of Martin Guerre to get an idea about how she approaches history. I also made a video about micro-histories, and I will link that below. That will probably give you the most context about the kind of history that she does. So this book, the title, let me look it up. The title is A Passion for History, and it is actually an interview between two historians, Denis Crouzet, who asks the questions, and Natalie Zemon Davis, who responds. Denis Crouzet is also a prominent 16th century historian in France. He works on the wars of religion. He is slightly younger than her, but also he's a very established scholar, a very big name in the field. And what I like about this work, A Passion for History, is that Creuset's questions are, I think, partially his own personal questions, and him also playing devil's advocate, where he asks questions that maybe Davis's critics might ask about her approach to history, about how she interacts with the figures she writes about, whether she is biased when she approaches any of these figures, whether her own biography has influenced her assumptions about the figures she writes about. Because microhistory tries to give an understanding of a community through the eyes of one individual. That is how microhistory is done. And what this devil's advocate style of interviewing does is it allows for Davis to not just respond to her critics, but to clarify her thought, and for her to really talk about how she views historiography, which is the study of doing history. Okay, so a lot of this book is about the histories that she has done, that she has written, but also kind of reflecting on what doing history is. Like, what is the purpose of studying history? And it was just a really interesting interview that, like I said, inspired a lot of personal thoughts and reflections. Quick biography. Natalie Zemon Davis grew up in the 1940s as a Jewish American. She talks about learning about the death camps in Germany only after the liberation. So, that's really interesting to see what she did know and what she didn't know about Hitler. She and her family opposed Hitler, of course, but a lot of her interactions have to do on the very local level. The casual anti-Semitism that existed. She came from a middle-class bourgeois family, as she describes it, went to really good schools, but she was always aware of her Jewish heritage. And even though she is an atheist, being Jewish is a huge part of her identity. And for her, Jewish identity is about resistance to oppression. And that is a huge part of Davis's life. Davis was involved in a lot of resistance movements, and actually, her passport was revoked in the 1950s during the Red Scare. Her husband, Chandler, actually served 6 months in prison. I think it's 6 months in prison. Maybe it's less, 4 months. There were several, I think, filmmakers who were first caught, or they were condemned for their films. And then, during the Red Scare, people were being subpoenaed. And Chandler, who really opposed the FBI's work, was then targeted. And not only was his passport revoked, but eventually he served time in prison. So Davis was very, very involved politically. And while she has distanced herself from the communist movement since, she has much more of a realist view, she likes to say, and less of a utopian view about communism and what it can accomplish. She has always been somewhat socialist. And, it's really interesting to see her talk about contemporary politics and to not shy away from that, because she says, yes, I'm a historian who studies the past, but I also feel that then as an intellectual, I have a responsibility to the present. And Davis tells the story of two scholars of the 16th century who lived during the German occupation. They were French scholars. There's Lucien Febvre, who wrote a book on Luther. I wanted to read. It was written in the 1920s, so it's definitely a book to read to understand how Reformation studies was done in the 1920s. And his Jewish colleague, Marc Bloch. And during the occupation, Lucien Febvre, it's not that he supported the Nazis, he wasn't a Nazi supporter, but because he tended to have more of an Erasmian spirit, he tried to hide his resistance in his publications. And because of that, he was able to keep his post at the Collège de France. Marc Bloch, on the other hand, lost his position at the university because he was Jewish. And then, because of his involvement in the resistance, he was eventually murdered by the Nazis. And I think this anecdote is interesting because it makes you think about how something like Erasmianism, which, if you don't know, Erasmus of Rotterdam was a 16th century figure who's often presented as someone who just didn't choose sides. He sympathized with the Protestants, but he never joined them. Because he felt that peace was more important than taking sides. Whereas something like that, maybe even for us today, is seen as, laudatory, when transplanted in a different historical context, seems like complicity. Lucien Febvre, after the death of his friend, really felt guilty, and perhaps rightfully so, for never standing up for his friend, for never writing openly against the Nazis. Sometimes not choosing sides means that you do choose sides. And there's a lot of conversation in this interview about that. I work on violence in the 16th century. A lot of my work is on martyrologies, massacres. I'm currently working on the trial of Martin Guerre, which isn't religious really at all, although Natalie Zemon Davis claims that it is, but it isn't in any case explicitly dealing with Protestantism. It is religious in the sense that its goal is to glorify God, but it isn't anything particularly Protestant, at least I think. But I do work on an ugly part of history. And I do feel a certain responsibility to tell these stories, first because I just have the ability to do so, and I feel, well, if I have the ability to do so, so maybe I should. I am not a historian. I am not trained as a historian, although I do work with history. My training is in literature, and I use literary tools to try to understand the ways in which people tell their own stories. This is why I like Natalie Zemon Davis, because though she is a historian, she really collaborates with literary scholars, and she does take a literary perspective on history. Not always, but she has embraced that approach, and it's something that, of course, I embrace. So I do feel a certain responsibility to think about the past and how, studying the past can tell us something about human behavior today. But then Crouzet says something that I think is really interesting. He says, well, sometimes, though, people can be so immersed in history that there becomes this myth of history, and this myth of history repeating itself that then paralyzes people or just makes people think of themselves as messianic, where their role in the world is messianic, and that can be so dangerous. Davis talks about certain religious trends. I mean, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, I mean, it exists today around the world where people look to the past as justification for their involvement in the world politically, in their opposition to particular groups. There's this certain apocalypticism, this certain eschatology that is tied to these movements that is based on a certain reading of history. And Denis Crouzet, when he asks Davis about that, whether that's a danger, and she says it absolutely is. I mean, she talks about George Bush and his involvement, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how Condoleezza Rice really saw the US as in a position like in the 1920s, and how he was seeing this repeating of history as this really positive thing. So this myth of history repeating itself can be very dangerous, depending on how it's used. But Davis also says that a lot of times studying history will show us how international, I mean, it's probably not the word, but how national boundaries are such a modern phenomenon. She says, yes, she is against that nationalist fury, these religious passions, that obsession with frontiers, with fixed and immovable boundaries and borders, which have become so strong in our time, and which run so counter to the porousness suggested by documents of the past. This is her, she's talking about her work on this Islamic travel writer, and, basically his own observations about Europe. And she was really struggling with certain elements of it, mostly how to end her book. And so she was asking Crouzet about how to end the book. But what she finds particularly striking in this man's life is, again, this transnational element to his story that we tend to ignore when we talk about even 16th century history, which is seen as the rise of nationalism in Europe. Davis is particularly interested in self-fashioning and how people fashion themselves, present themselves, shape themselves and their works in dialogue with their societies, and how contingent someone's identity is. I was initially very interested in self-fashioning. Have I made a video about self-fashioning? I'm not sure. I think I have. I'll link it below if I have. But self-fashioning can be taken to an extreme, where you think that everybody is just manipulating their persona to please other people and to be famous. That can be a very extreme version. But there's definitely a lot of truth to it in the 16th century. We talk about the rise of the individual in the 16th century. I mean, there is some truth to that. Okay, let's talk about my own experience with history. Natalie Zemon Davis talks a lot about her passion for reading historical documents. And that's where it all began for me. So when I was 18, I was at the research library, and there were 54 volumes of Luther's writings. And I didn't know much about Reformation history. I always thought it was taught very poorly in school. At least I suspected that it was. We didn't spend a lot of time on it. And so, I had certain ideas about who Luther was, but I'd never read anything by him. And I remember picking up one of his volumes and being shocked by the tone that he takes. And it just was, I guess, different than what I expected. There's a certain myth of Luther that was just shattered as soon as I read his sermons and his treatises. At the same time, I was really interested in Franciscan history and really interested in quests for the historical Francis of Assisi and what we can know about him through his the legends about him. But also how that quest has largely been abandoned by historians. And so instead of, trying to reconstruct this historical Francis behind the legends about him, there's now an attempt at trying to understand what these legends might say about Francis of Assisi. It's a much more positive approach to the legends. That means, of course, that we're looking at narrative and we're looking at language and literature, all of which really interests me. I found a book of sermons from the 14th century where some Catholic priest is talking about how the Wycliffites are coming to destroy their faith. And, all of this meant that I was encountering religious polemics. And nothing is more dramatic than religious conflict. I think these kind of wars, they reveal so much about humanity. Davis is all about a history of hope, but I guess I'm more pessimistic. I'm more pessimistic because I see in these works very intelligent people who are probably otherwise also compassionate individuals saying and doing things that are just monstrous. And I wonder about that. I wonder about what that means for us as human beings. That, it's not just, the serial killers out there who are, perverted and they're just not human in many ways that do these sort of things. But it's intellectuals who are compassionate, who are ordinary people, and not just ordinary people, but people who should know better, maybe, who make what appear to be very logical arguments for religious violence, or for any kind of violence. And it is this thing that I have found to be troubling from my reading of history, but also extremely fascinating. I think primary sources are incredible. They reveal so much, and now that I'm starting to be able to read 16th century handwriting, it's like I now have access to even more sources than I used to. Sometimes I see on Goodreads reviews people saying that a certain history book has too many primary sources, and I just don't understand that, because to me that's where the excitement lies. And particularly when you can hold it in your hands and to know that there were real people who once held these books in their hands and that they told their own story, and now we get to read their story hundreds, even thousands of years later. It's amazing. And that is, I so share this excitement that Davis describes in her work. And this was something I was very embarrassed by, because I was also interested in the history of theology, and I just never really shared that because I was a complete nerd, and that's what I did for fun. And then one summer I got to do some work at the University of Michigan with two scholars on the lives of Barlaam and Josaphat, who were Christian saints. Not so much on the Roman Catholic calendar anymore. I think they're on the Orthodox calendar. But the story of Josaphat is the story of the Buddha, but Christianized. And I was looking at different versions of the story across cultures. And it was so fascinating to me, and it also showed me that I could use this passion that I had in ways that were seen as more acceptable. And so when I eventually, after a year of doing a PhD in science, entomology, insects, and when I came back to doing a master's in French, I realized that I was going to think about what this could mean from a literary perspective. And I somehow ended up, I thought I would be a medievalist. As you know, my channel used to be the medieval reader. Now I am more of the Renaissance reader. And I never really thought that I would be able to work in the Reformation, but that I get to do that now is really incredible. And I feel incredibly privileged to be able to work on something that I really found fascinating for years. Academia isn't what it was when Davis was in school. Davis and Crouzet represent an academia that doesn't exist anymore. There aren't really full professorships anymore. And I don't know what's going to happen after this coronavirus outbreak dies down. Will universities go back to having face-to-face classes I mean, the whole adjunct system is very exploitative. But even if I can't get a job in academia afterward, I am very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do a PhD now and to do research. And, you know, reading this interview really encouraged me to get this paper published that I'm working on, because this is my time when I can, even in the smallest of ways, contribute to our understanding of history, to our understanding of humanity, to our understanding of societies. And, you know, it's something that I really enjoy. So I hope that this video was interesting. I know that a passion for history is actually quite expensive to get, but if at some point you have access to this interview, I highly recommend it. It's really, really interesting. And, you know, I've wanted to talk about my own experience with scholarship, and I've never really found the right time to do that, and I feel like this book really gave me that opportunity. If you ever end up going back to university and you're a university student, you have access to a research library, go into these, you know, go and find some of these archival works. You don't have to go to the special collections. You can, and that's actually really cool because you get to, you know, hold the book in your hand. But even like a facsimile, a facsimile or reprint, some edited work, it's incredible, and you get to encounter these historical figures through their writings, to see what they have in common with us, but also to respect that you're working with historical text, and that there will always be things that you just don't know, and that not knowing is part of the game. It's part, you know, it's an adventure, you know, you're like Bilbo Baggins, you're like going off to kill this dragon. So anyway, this is a long rambly video. I have never done one of these before, but I don't think I'm going to be editing this too much, so hopefully you guys are staying safe and finding time to read for yourselves. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.